Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. Flying used to be my passion. The quiet hum of the engines, the routine of service, the calm predictability of it all. But at 35,000 feet, predictability can vanish in an instant. I was working a red-eye from LAX to Tokyo, a full flight with over 300 passengers. A mix of exhausted business travelers, excited tourists, and the usual handful of fidgety flyers who couldn't relax, no matter how smooth the ride. I'd done this route dozens of times. Same safety briefing, same meal service, same questions about legroom, but that night was different. It started 2 hours into the flight. A call light blinked from row 17. I walked down the aisle, already rehearsing the usual reassurances. Probably a nervous flyer, maybe someone feeling lightheaded. But when I reached the seat, I saw the man slumped over, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His wife clutched his arm, her voice shaking. "He's burning up," she whispered. "He said he felt sick before we boarded, but now he won't wake up." My stomach twisted. We were over the Pacific, no turning back, no hospital. The best we had was a medical kit and a satellite call to a doctor on the ground. I knelt beside the man, shaking his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. His skin felt clammy. His breath was shallow, almost non-existent. I signaled to another flight attendant, and she hurried to grab the emergency oxygen. We needed to get him stable until we could land. But even as I reached for his pulse, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't moving. Then, just as I leaned in closer, his eyes snapped open. They weren't normal. His pupils were blown wide, his gaze unfocused, hungry. Before I could react, his body convulsed, and he lunged forward. I barely had time to throw myself backward as his teeth snapped together where my arm had been. His wife screamed. Passengers gasped, twisting in their seats to see what was happening. My heart pounded as I scrambled away, but he wasn't going after me anymore. He turned on his wife. The woman barely had time to react before he sank his teeth into her shoulder. She shrieked, flailing against him, but he wouldn't let go. Blood. No blood, just a dark stain spreading through her blouse as she collapsed into the aisle. Chaos erupted. Passengers shouted. Some scrambled to their feet, others pressed against their armrests, unsure whether to run or stay put. My training kicked in. Stay calm, take control. But how do you control something like this? The other flight attendants rushed forward, one of them holding a defibrillator. Our best option when a passenger became unresponsive. But the man wasn't unresponsive anymore. He was alive. Or something close to it. A deep, guttural sound came from his throat as he pushed himself up. His wife lay twitching beside him. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps. And then, just like him, her eyes opened. Identical, dark, empty. And I realized whatever had happened to him was happening to her too. For a moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the low hum of the engines and the wheezing breaths of the woman on the floor. I could see her fingers twitching, her body seizing up like something inside her was rewiring. Then, without warning, she sat up. Her head snapped toward me first, eyes hollow and glassy, but aware in a way that made my skin crawl. Then she turned to the nearest passenger, a man in a suit, still frozen in his seat, too shocked to react. She lunged. His scream broke the spell. The cabin exploded into chaos. Passengers shoved into the aisles, climbing over seats, trampling anything in their way. Some bolted toward the front, desperate to reach the cockpit, while others fumbled with their seatbelts, too panicked to get them undone. A baby wailed somewhere near the back. Someone knocked over a drink cart. I was still kneeling, trying to process what I had just seen, 2 people, completely unresponsive 1 second, attacking like rabid animals the next. My radio crackled. "We need restraints now," came the voice of one of the senior flight attendants. I forced myself to move. We carried flex cuffs for unruly passengers, but this wasn't just an unruly passenger. I yanked open an overhead bin and grabbed them anyway. By the time I turned back, the man in the suit was on the floor, his hands clutching his arm. Blood, no blood, just torn fabric, spreading down his sleeve. His attacker was still thrashing, still clawing, and now others were starting to change. Row 17 wasn't the only place where someone had gotten sick before the flight. A woman in first class suddenly convulsed, knocking over her tray table as her body seized. A flight attendant tried to help her, only for her to jerk upright and sink her teeth into his forearm. Another passenger collapsed near the lavatory, writhing on the ground, fingers twitching. The realization hit me like a truck. It's spreading. The overhead speakers crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We are experiencing a medical emergency and are diverting for an emergency landing. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." It was the right call, but I knew deep down there was no remaining seated. The infection was moving too fast. If we didn't get control now, we weren't going to make it to the ground. I grabbed the defibrillator and sprinted toward the first infected passenger. 2 other flight attendants were already there, one trying to hold him down, while the other fumbled with a medical mask. "Move!" I shouted, my voice barely cutting through the panic. They did. I ripped open his shirt, pressed the paddles to his chest, and hit the charge. His body convulsed. For a split second, he went still. Then he twisted toward me and lunged. I barely got my arms up in time. His teeth snapped an inch from my face, his fingers clawing at my uniform. My back slammed into a seat, my breath knocked from my lungs. I was going to die, then bang! Not a gunshot. The sound of something heavy slamming against a skull. The man went limp, collapsing onto the floor. I looked up to see a passenger, an older man, gripping a metal thermos with shaking hands. He'd swung it like a club, knocking the infected passenger unconscious. I gasped for air, nodding in thanks. But there was no time for relief. More passengers were turning. More screams filled the air. And outside the window, the horizon was still an endless stretch of dark ocean. We were nowhere near land. The plane was falling apart. Not from turbulence, not from a mechanical failure, but from the chaos inside the cabin. Screams drowned out the hum of the engines. People shoved and tripped over each other, desperate to get away from the infected passengers. A woman pounded on the cockpit door, begging to be let in. The pilot wouldn't open it. He couldn't. If the infection reached the flight deck, we were done. The man with the thermos helped me to my feet. His hands were shaking, eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is happening?" he panted. I didn't have an answer. A sharp crack split the air. I turned just in time to see a man slam the emergency exit door with his shoulder, trying to force it open. I felt my blood run cold. "Stop!" I yelled, shoving my way through the panicked crowd. "You can't open that at altitude." He turned wild eyes toward me. "We have to get out of here." I grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "You'll kill everyone." He tried to shove me off, but another passenger pulled him away. Someone screamed behind me, another person turning, their body jerking violently as the infection took hold. We weren't winning this. I pressed my radio to my lips, my voice shaking. "Captain, we need an emergency landing now." Static. Then, finally, the captain's voice. Low, tense. "We're still too far from land." "How long?" A pause. "At least an hour." An hour. We weren't going to make it that long. A sudden thud against the cockpit door made my heart skip a beat. I turned in time to see one of the infected slamming their body against the reinforced metal, their mouth open in a silent, hungry snarl. The woman who had been pounding on the door was gone. Either she ran or she was taken. If that door gave way, the flight crew wouldn't be able to keep control of the plane. Think. Help me move them. I grabbed the nearest able-bodied passenger and pointed to the unconscious infected man. We need to get them to the back of the plane. The old man with the thermos nodded, grabbing one of the infected by the arms. Another passenger, young, maybe a college student, took the legs. Together, we started dragging. It wasn't easy. The plane was still mid-flight, and turbulence rattled the overhead compartments. Every time the plane shook, someone screamed. We barely made it past the galley when one of the unconscious infected twitched. Then he woke up. His mouth snapped at the college student's arm. The kid yelped, dropping his legs and stumbling backward. The infected man thrashed, kicking and clawing until, wham! The old man brought his thermos down on his head again. "We need to contain them," I gasped, looking around. The lavatory. I scrambled forward, pulling the door open. "Shove them inside." The passengers hesitated only a second before we lifted the infected bodies, stuffing them into the tiny space. I slammed the door and locked it, pressing my back against the metal. Muffled snarls came from inside. It wouldn't hold forever. I turned to the others, my breath coming fast. We need to keep anyone else from getting infected. The college student looked down at his arm where the thing had almost bitten him. His hands trembled. How do we do that? I swallowed. We separate the sick from the healthy. The old man's face darkened. And if someone is infected? I didn't answer. Because deep down, I already knew there weren't enough lavatories on this plane to lock them all away. And soon, we'd run out of places to hide. The lavatory door rattled behind me, metal creaking as the things inside thrashed against it. They weren't stopping. They never stopped. The other passengers stood in a tight group, eyes darting between each other, scanning for signs of sickness. The college kid kept rubbing his arm, like he could feel the infection seeping in, even though he hadn't been bitten. Not yet. We were out of options. Then my radio crackled. "Cabin crew." The captain's voice came through, tight and controlled, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "We've been cleared for an emergency landing in Honolulu. 30 minutes. 30 minutes. I pressed the button. "Captain, we won't last that long." Another thud against the cockpit door. A dent was forming. The captain must have seen it on the security camera because his voice changed. "Understood. We're accelerating descent. Hold tight." I exhaled, my grip tightening around the intercom. "Passengers, we are making an emergency landing. Please, stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." No one listened. People were still moving, pressing toward the front, away from the lavatory, away from the infected still loose in the cabin. We had locked some away, but not all. Another growl. I turned just in time to see a woman fall. An infected man was on her, teeth snapping inches from her face. Her screams cut through the cabin like a blade. The old man with the thermos stepped forward again, ready to swing, but he wasn't fast enough. The infected's teeth sank into her neck. Passengers scrambled away as she thrashed beneath him, blood soaking her blouse. No blood. Just torn fabric, skin paling too quickly. She was already turning. "Move!" I shouted, grabbing the old man and pulling him toward the galley. The plane lurched, the descent speeding up. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The cockpit door dented again. We weren't going to land in time. A flight attendant near the jump seat met my eyes, fear clear on her face. She knew what I was thinking. We couldn't let them reach the cockpit. I grabbed the food cart. "Help me push it!" The old man and the college kid jumped in, shoving with all their strength. We rammed it against the cockpit door, creating a barricade. It wouldn't hold forever, but it bought us seconds. The plane shuddered as we hit turbulence. More snarls, more screams, more passengers turning. I had no idea how many of us were left. Then the intercom crackled again. "Brace for impact!" The words sent an electric shock through my spine. I threw myself into the nearest seat, yanking the belt across my lap. The old man and the college kid did the same. The remaining passengers fumbled for their seats, some barely latching on as the plane plummeted. Wind roared outside. The infected slammed against seats, the ceiling, the walls. One of them flew forward, crashing against the food cart. I shut my eyes. Then, impact, a violent jolt, metal screeching. Overhead bins bursting open. Then darkness. I woke up to the scent of burning. Smoke filled the cabin, curling through the wreckage. The emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the mangled seats. The plane had broken apart. I unbuckled myself with trembling fingers, my ears ringing. Passengers groaned around me, some of them. Others didn't move at all. The cockpit was open now. The pilots were slumped forward, unconscious, or worse. And the infected... I turned my head and froze. They were still moving. The ones who had survived the crash were already getting up, their bones broken, their bodies mangled, but their hunger unchanged. The old man groaned beside me. He was alive. The college kid, too. I grabbed his arm, pulling him up. "Run!" We stumbled through the wreckage, shoving past broken seats and bodies, forcing our way toward the emergency exit. The door had been torn off in the crash. Outside, the night air was thick with smoke. Fires burned along the wings, palm trees bent in the wind. We had landed somewhere, but we weren't safe. The infected were crawling out of the wreckage behind us. And in the distance, through the trees, beyond the runway lights, I saw something worse. A dark, shifting mass moving through the city beyond the airport. More of them. The infection had already spread here. We had survived the flight, but the outbreak was just beginning. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.